I only learned it in high school, right? So that was really good. Every family has stories. They are the threads woven into the fabric which make up a family's historical tapestry. As a boy, I was always fascinated by hearing these stories of past generations, of those people whose blood I shared, but whose memory could only be regained by the retelling of their lives' experiences. Reliving their adventures was like an invitation for me to be anything that I wanted to be, and embracing the idea that whatever they had experienced in their lives could somehow be possible in mine. I'd like to share one of those stories with you tonight, namely that of my father. It encompasses 3 different continents, 4 countries, and almost 81 years, but it all weaves down into what I hope you will find to be a fascinating life. We are actually lucky to have my dad here, so of course he can tell me if I get any of these facts or dates or names wrong. So. Now, my dad's journey started, of course, on the first day of his life, or should I perhaps say 4 days before that. Because on November 19th, 1936, Henrique Manuel de Sousa Galvão was born in Almancil, a city in the south of Portugal in the Algarve. Perhaps some of you have been there on vacation. Now, he was born to a relatively poor farmer family. His parents were Antonia and Manuel Galvão, and at that time, he had an older brother named Diamantino. Later on, he would be joined by his only sister, Leonor, and the youngest brother that he would have, which was Firmino. Now, when I say that they were born into a relatively poor family, I mean it. They lived in a 2-room farmhouse, and the room that the children shared was also sometimes shared by the animals when it was cold. So you could say that they lived in a state of poverty. Here's one of the rare pictures of my family way back then. My dad is over here. This is my avô, or my grandmother, and other family members in the back here. Now, I mentioned this birth date and then 4 days before. The story goes that my grandmother, after she gave birth to my grandfather, skipped ahead. So the story goes that after my grandmother gave birth to my dad, she actually, within a couple of hours, was up doing farm and family tasks. She never got around to going to the city hall to let them know that she had had a baby. She didn't get around to doing this actually until 4 days later, on the 23rd. And at that point, she went to the city hall and she thought it was simply easier to lie and simply say, yeah, I just had the baby, than to try to explain back. So on his birth certificate, it actually says the 23rd. Now, I myself have always been a fan of this because if I forget to call on the 19th, I've got like 4 days grace period. So it works out really well for me. And the funniest thing about this story is the fact that my grandmother never got around to telling my dad this until he was in his 40s. So, Portugal back then was a very, very different place than it is today. Back then it was ruled by a dictator named Antonio Salazar. He came to power in 1932 and never let go of that power until he died in 1968, 36 years later. Now, here he is on the cover of Time magazine in 1946, labeled as the Dean of Dictators and compared to a rotten apple. And that's very much the way that it was. Especially for a poor farmer family, it was extremely difficult making ends meet. There were many stories that my family told me about the poverty that they endured. For example, the government would come and they would take not only taxes from you, but a lot of the harvest that you had just gathered in fall. It was so bad that my grandfather ended up digging a hole down below the floor of the house that they had so that he could store things secretly. Things like olive oil that he could sell year-round to be able to make the money that they needed to survive. Another story that Diamantino told me was that when Diamantino, my uncle, my dad, and my grandfather used to go out in the field in this hot baking Portuguese sun all day long, they'd be working, and when noon would come around, they would stop for lunch. But very often they had so little food, sometimes they would only have one sausage between all 3 of them. Typically my grandfather would cut that sausage in half, give it to both of his sons, despite the fact that he was doing the lion's share of the labor. My grandmother never learned to read nor write, and let's say the economic situation got so dire at one point that my grandfather decided he was going to do what most able-bodied Portuguese men were doing at the time, and that was going abroad, getting a job there, so that he could send back money to his family in Portugal. And that's exactly what he did. This is a picture of a photo. This is a photo of a family that was probably of similar economic means around about the same time. Now, you can imagine, for my dad in Diamantino, it was sort of difficult. With the father being out of the house, that means that they had to pick up a lot of the chores that the dad normally did. And effectively, that meant that schooling was only a second priority, if that. As a matter of fact, my dad he actually had less than 3 years of schooling in his entire life. And most of that was before the age of 10. When he did talk about school, he talked about a one-room schoolhouse, and it wasn't really planned. The kids that showed up that day, no matter what the ages, would have to listen to the exact same lesson from the teacher. So it wasn't all that effective. Another thing, which was quite different than what you're used to today in Portugal, is arranged marriage. I had no idea that this existed until I heard this story. And as a matter of fact, my uncle and my aunt, both of whom are still alive, and relatively happy, I would say, are a product of an arranged marriage. That means that their parents decided who they would marry. They didn't really have a choice in the matter. And although my dad wasn't set up in an arranged marriage, he might as well have been. Because from a very, very young age, probably 5 or 6, he had been promised to marry this girl next door, in the farm next door. Her name was Elvira. Okay? And he remembers sort of playing, husband and wife and baby, and thinking to himself, talking to Elvira about the fact that someday they would be doing this for real. It was just this assumption that would happen. Very different than today. And that's the way that my dad grew up. Yeah, working in the fields and hanging out with Elvira. That was until 1953. At the ripe old age of 16, my grandfather, who had been in Venezuela for a number of years, wrote to my grandmother. And he said, look, now that my sons are of age, I want them to come to Venezuela and replace me so I can go back and hang out with my family for a while. So imagine this. You're 16 years old. You've never been more than 10 kilometers from your house. You've never been on a train. And all of a sudden somebody's telling you have to go to a different country on a different continent with a completely different language. So for my dad, this was an invitation to excitement. He was just like, adventure, this is so cool, I get to leave. But of course, all the positives have a bit of a negative. All these plans with Elvira would have to be put on hold. With this familial decision made, he took the plunge. Here's a picture of him. Okay, he is over here. This is Diamantino, my uncle. And this was taken right after they got on their first train, headed up to Lisbon, and this was taken literally hours before they got on the boat to head to Venezuela. Okay. Now, I asked him about the clothes, because I was thinking, these clothes actually look pretty fine. For somebody who didn't have a lot of money. And he said that, no matter how poor you were, you still had to have one nice set of clothes to wear to go to church, for weddings, things like that. So, in any case, looking pretty dapper. And then he got on the Auriga. It was an Italian boat, and it took almost 2 weeks to cross the Atlantic. Back then, of course, this wasn't a luxury liner. It took a little while. And imagine this scene. After 2 weeks of being on the open ocean, he arrives at the dock, okay, in La Guaira in Venezuela. Now, my grandfather, who had not seen his 2 sons for how many years? I can almost imagine him just coming to the dockside, just trying to figure out which ones were his kids, right? But he finally finds them, and to celebrate the reunion, they end up going out to a bar and having a beer. Okay. Now, to give you a bit of a feeling of what Venezuela was like at the time, here are a couple of pictures of Caracas in 1953. As you can see, clearly the war did not affect South America half as badly as it did Europe. So there's quite a lot of development and money going into it. also this. I mean, really not a bad place to be. But this did not necessarily speak to my dad and my grandfather's life. My grandfather had set up a very small brick-making factory. And when you think of factory, you can't think of big machines or anything like that. This was extremely manual labor. My dad talked about how they would take wooden bowls, put them on the ground, and pour the brick into that. Then after the bricks were fired, he would have to take them out of the oven, put them in hand carts, and then transport them to where they had been delivered, or where they had been ordered from. So you can see this. Despite the fact that this was dirty, heavy work, he still has this look of pride on his face. I think this is pretty cool. Now, in the evening, life wasn't all that much more luxurious. He ended up going back, and his room was an old, dilapidated bus that had been turned into a room for 3 people, 3 of the workers at the factory. That's where he slept on these hot Venezuelan nights. Well, after 6 months of my grandfather having settled in his 2 boys, he was like, I'm out of here, I'm going back to Portugal. So he leaves, and this is the point in time that I'd like to stress one of the things that appears and reappears in my dad's life. The point, or the idea of reinventing oneself. Reinventing yourself, when you don't like the conditions around you, you basically reinvent them to fit your idea of where you want to be. And this is exactly what he did. So he quit the job pretty much as soon as my grandfather left. He was like, nah, I'm out of here too. And he picked up a job that was a little bit better, right? So he got this job on a bicycle, and he would ride around and sell either bread or ice cream. A bit more respectable, definitely cleaner work, and you can sort of see this look of pride on his face again, right? He told me this one story about this where he said that one day that it was extremely hot, he was like, I don't have that many sales, I might as well just have a scoop of ice cream. So he started to have a scoop of ice cream, and then after a little while, thought the same thing again, had another scoop, and by the time he went home, or went back to the office, so to say, it was difficult to actually pay out all the product that he'd eaten. But in any case, he was moving on up. But it didn't stop there. He decided that if he really wanted to sort of make something of himself, he needed to have yet a better job. And he was thinking being a waiter in a hotel was a great way to do that. So there was the Grand Hotel Bolivar in Ciudad Bolivar. Now, in doing research on all of this story over the last couple of years, one thing that I realized is that this hotel and the next hotel I'll mention were actually pretty famous places. This is where presidents would go, movie stars, when they went to Venezuela. So this was not a bad place to actually have a job as a waiter. And it was so funny. As I was going through this presentation with my dad today, he mentioned a story I had never heard before. This guy, okay, and him were friends. Okay, so my dad here on the left, these guys were friends. So they're walking through this garden in the back of the hotel, and apparently there's this beautiful woman from Trinidad. Okay, so my dad starts chatting her up, and he says that he's pretty much on the way to convince her to actually go out with him, right? So I think something like he goes away, comes back later on, meets her again. So things are definitely going in the right direction, and he thinks he's going to get a date. Well, this gentleman comes out, and he's just like, oh, can you introduce me to your friends? And my dad's like, oh, sure, yeah, this is him, this is her. And immediately, they fall in love. and it was for real. He ended up being the best man at this guy's wedding. So. But again, he kept on moving up. So he thought that the next best place to work would be a hotel in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela now. Okay. So, and just to give you a feeling of sort of the importance of this place, it made itself onto a stamp even back then in Venezuela. So this was a Hotel Tamanaco, and here are a couple of pictures of him there. And that wasn't the last job that he had in Venezuela. He decided that he wanted to go into business for himself. Again, taking a step up and reinventing his circumstances. He bought an old truck and drove out to the farmland, generally where farmers didn't necessarily take their produce into town. He would buy the produce there and then bring it into the farmer's market and then sort of resell it almost as a wholesaler to the people selling vegetables. Good. Well, I'd like to take a bit of a political sidestep at this point and talk about these guys, because it's difficult to talk about this time and this epic without thinking about the political ramifications. After all, this is the 1950s and 60s where tons of revolutions are happening in Central and South America, right? And two of the most important players in this were these guys, Fidel Castro on the left and Che on the right. And it just so happens that my dad has a tendency to sort of end up running into people, relatively famous people in his life. And these were some of the, well, I'll tell you a story. So in any case, one of the hotels that my dad was working at was the place where Che had organized an event to drum up support for his cause. Ends up that my dad ended up talking to Che for a little bit. Also at that event was Fidel Castro's sister, who was gathering money for her brother's own revolution. And just in case anybody's here from the US consulate, I should probably not mention that he donated 500 bolivars to her cause. Just forget that I said that. So, and speaking of politics, he also lived through a coup d'etat. On January 23rd, 1958, there was a revolution in Venezuela. He ended up working at the Hotel Tamanaco at the time, which was only about a kilometer away from Miraflores, which was the presidential palace where the dictator was overthrown. So he saw scenes like this up close. And when I asked him about this, he said that, yeah, it looked very much like this, and pretty much the whole city was shut down. Your goal was just to keep your head down and not get pulled into trouble. And then there's this gentleman. So, coincidence, as you'll see, plays a very driving force in my dad's life. And this was one of the first ones. So, there's a lot of coincidences, similarities between this gentleman and my dad. Number one, they're both Portuguese. Number two, they both lived in the same place in Venezuela at the same time. Number three, they both share the same name, Henrique Galvão. The main difference is this gentleman was a Portuguese revolutionary, and his goal was to overthrow the government. And he did that in the following way, or he tried to do it in the following way. He gathered a whole bunch of like-minded thinkers, Portuguese revolutionaries and Spanish revolutionaries, and they wanted to hijack a boat, the Santa Maria, which was a Portuguese cruise liner. So in 1961, they did just that. They went to Legueira in Venezuela, and they boarded the boat. They pretty much overpowered the crew, but they did it in a way that I think only one person got hurt, right? It wasn't sort of like today where tons of people get killed or anything. So one person got hurt. Otherwise, they pretty much just took over the ship, and then their goal was to go radio silent so that nobody could find them. Instead of going to Portugal, they would reroute the ship to Angola, where they would pick up more revolutionaries, then head up to Portugal to overthrow Antonio Salazar. And they got pretty far. For about 3 days, they were completely radio silent, until the Venezuelan authorities asked the US government to say, hey, can you look for this ship to figure out where these guys are? So here's a picture of the US plane. Having found the ship, they sort of recontacted the ship, and they convinced Galvão that there was pretty much no place to go. He said, okay, that's fine, I'm going to give myself up in Brazil. They were like, okay, that's fine. So he went there, and he actually got away pretty much scot-free, because the Brazilian authorities ended up welcoming him with open arms. Okay? But that is not where the story ends. Because my dad just happened to be driving up to Legueira on the same day that Henrique Galvão tried to hijack this ship. And it just so happens that my dad's uncle also wanted to go up to Legueira because he was going to go on a ship. Ends up that my dad's uncle had like 3 bags with him, and he asked my dad to help carry them. So my dad said he picked these things up, threw them in his car, and the last one was this relatively large duffel bag that had metal inside. It was really heavy, and he picked it up, threw it in the back, didn't really think much of it. Up until the point in time that he dropped his uncle off to get on the Santa Maria. And it was only in retrospect that he realized that his own uncle was one of the revolutionaries who helped him Galvão hijack the ship. Every every family has black sheep. Ours just happens to be a hijacker, but it's okay.
For a good cause.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So 1962 rolls around. And by this time, my dad had been in Venezuela for 9 years. He had really reestablished himself, right, in this country. And at this point, my grandfather came back from Portugal to Venezuela, not to start another business, but rather to get his sons to come back to Europe. And there were a lot of good reasons. Political stability, right? Europe was a lot more stable. Economic stability. And Europe was a lot closer to Portugal than it was Venezuela. But he didn't want my dad and Diamantino to come to Portugal because, again, it wasn't very good there still. Under Salazar, he wanted to go to France, where he had an uncle. And if it sounds like we have family everywhere, we do. It's crazy. Like, when we visit Portugal and we're going down the street, my dad's just like, oh, there's a cousin, and this is an uncle. I'm just like, it's like one big extended family. It's crazy. But in any case, so with a little bit of nudging, my grandfather got his boys to get on this ship, the Bianca C. And if you think it was easy for my dad to get on the ship shortly after this hijacking took place, it wasn't. It took about 2 hours of convincing the Venezuelan authorities to let him even board this ship. Okay, but he finally got on, and they headed to Marseille. And speaking of ill-fated ships, okay, only a couple of months after my family rode on this boat, there was an engine fire which eventually spread, and it caused the ship to go down to the bottom of the ocean. So if anybody's a diver and wants to go to one of the 10 best diving spots in the world, you can still see the Bianca C today. Okay, Paris, 1962. Now, my dad had some experience in reinventing himself in Venezuela, and he would definitely need it in Paris as well. After all, this is a whole new language and a completely different culture. He really stressed how Venezuela, that was one way, but it was to a certain extent a little bit backward. The educational level wasn't very high, whereas Paris was something completely different. Right? These are some images from 1962. It's sort of reminiscent of the 1950s in the US, right? And my dad found it to be, he talks about it like being in one big university, right? Just learning all the time. And I love this picture because he just looks so French, doesn't he? It's just like the typical, exactly what you would expect from a 1960s Frenchman. This was one of the first cars that he had. And a number of things changed for my dad. He was picking up French relatively quickly. He also changed the way that he worked. He wasn't working in hotels anymore, but rather he started working in very large factories. Right? For example, he worked for Renault and also for 3M. And one other major thing that changed for him is for the first time in his life, he met somebody who he thought he could marry. Her name was Ramonda. And Ramonda had a 5-year-old son named Patrick. Ramonda was a widow. Her husband had died just a couple of years earlier in a work accident. Now, the two of them met, they fell in love, and it went relatively quickly to the extent that Ramonda's father had actually donated them land, and everybody had the idea that they would build a house on it. And even though the relationship was relatively good, there were two main things which always sort of stuck out as negatives. Number one, Ramonda said that she would never marry my dad, despite the fact that he wanted to marry her. And it wasn't because she had some undying love for this husband who had passed away, but rather because she didn't want to lose the financial benefits from the French government for being a widow. The second problem was probably caused by the first, is my guess, which is Patrick never really respected my dad's authority because he would always say, "You're not my dad." But hey, no relationship is perfect, so they lived with it and continued on. I love old cars, so I want to throw up a couple of photos of these. Does anybody recognize this one up here? So it's a 1957 Panhard. And a bit of a funny story about this. My dad said that one icy morning when he was driving to work, he was going around a curve, and he basically slid off the road in this car and had a rollover accident in this field. Now, this was well before the day of mandatory seatbelts, so he was being tossed and turned within this car as he was, as this thing was rolling around. When it finally landed, he was able to sort of come to, took a look at himself. He was like, okay, nothing's too broken. Nothing was too broken on the car, except the fact that the windshield was completely gone. And he was just like, this is really strange, what is this? So he got out of his car and started looking around, and then found, some distance away in the field, this windshield was laying there as if it had been carefully placed on the ground. Not a scratch on it, no cracks, nothing. So he picked it up, put it in his backseat, and got it reinstalled. So. And time moves on. 6 years after he comes to France, he decides to go on a vacation. For the first time, he has the time and the money to go back to Portugal, 15 years after he's left. So, he takes Ramonda and Patrick. And of course, they're welcomed with open arms from the family. And one day, of course, you know, who's been to Portugal here? Okay. So of course, you go to the beach, right? He took the family to the beach, and off in the distance, he sees a family. And he sort of recognizes the family. So he makes his way closer, and then he recognizes this is the family who lived next door to him in Portugal. So he goes up, hasn't seen him in 15 years, so he starts greeting everybody, saying hello, and then is just awestruck by this woman who's sitting in the middle of them. And this is exactly who you're thinking. This is Elvira. Bit of an awkward situation. So he sees Elvira, and he introduces her to Ramonda, and the group hangs out during the day. All fine, no cat fights, nothing like that. And but this wasn't the only coincidence. In the next couple of days, he runs into Elvira a couple of times, but this time alone. And as you do, they start talking about the past 15 years, right? After all, they were supposed to be together. So they're talking about their lives. My dad tells her about his life, and you know, both the positives and the negatives with Ramonda. And then she tells him that she has recently moved to New York City to start this dream of life in America. But she's divorced, has 2 kids, but she's recently divorced. Well, you probably see where this is going. So both of them are wrapped up with this idea that this is not just coincidence. This must be fate, leading them back together again, right? So they part ways. My dad goes back to France, but within a couple of weeks, he tells Ramonda that he cannot be together with her anymore. Instead, he moves in with his brother and writes Elvira. And then he buys a ticket on none other than the Queen Elizabeth. And it wasn't just any trip on the Queen Elizabeth, this was the very last trip of the Queen Elizabeth that she ever took. Okay? Again, these just funny coincidences coming. So, he says that it was an absolute party the entire way over, right? Because this was the last trip of this famous ship. So champagne, cake, all this time. And one of the coolest things, at least for me, with the fact of this being the last time that it traveled, was the fact that there are lots of pictures of it coming into New York Harbor. This is one of them. And my dad says that he remembers, as they're coming into New York Harbor, looking out at the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building and just the grandeur of New York City that he'd always heard about, but never dreamed about coming and seeing in real life. And on some of the other pictures, you know, he looked at it and he was just like, I'm one of these guys right over here, which is pretty cool. Reinvention. Talking about reinventing himself, it's a really good thing that he had all this experience, because this was going to be the biggest challenge of them all. Portuguese, Spanish, French, they're all sort of related Romance languages, but English is something completely different, isn't it? When he left France, he had signed over the land, the house, and most of his belongings to Ramonda. So he had very little money left, and most of that he spent on the ticket on the ship. He landed with $50 in his pocket. But it was no problem, because he had this contact, right? Elvira. Except, she didn't show up to pick him up. This did not go according to plan. So he's waiting on the dock, and he's just like, you know, this is Queen Elizabeth, I mean, she can't really miss it, right? It's not a small boat. And so he waits, and he waits, and he waits until nightfall, until somebody that he had traveled with finally says, you know what, you can go down the block, and there's a YMCA where you can get a hotel room for $3 a night. You may want to try that. So we did that. And he came back the next day, waiting for Elvira, and she still doesn't show up. This was a problem. So he finally found out where she lived and went and confronts her, and was just like, what's the deal? Why didn't you pick me up? At that point, she gave an explanation, which was that When you wrote your card from France, you just put Elizabeth. And I didn't know that it was a Queen Elizabeth. I thought you were coming to Elizabeth, New Jersey. And I didn't really want to drive there. Bit of a shifty explanation, but nonetheless, he took it, and he decided to settle down into this life in New York. Now, to take another sidestep into sort of a political and sociological look at New York in 1968, keep in mind, if you're familiar with history, within a couple of months of him landing, right before, both Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, and Martin Luther King had been cut down by sniper's bullets. It seemed like in New York City, everybody was striking. The police, the firemen, even the trash men had a strike. And within 9 days, 100,000 tons of rubbish had piled up on New York City streets. But of course you have race wars, right? Cities burning because of race issues. And of course we can't forget the Vietnam War, which was really getting up into like a fevered pitch in 1968, as well as the counter-demonstrations. And this is the backdrop that my dad had to settle into without any English. He got an apartment on Sullivan Street, and I was lucky enough to go to New York earlier this year, and I sort of retraced his footsteps, went to a lot of the places that he went to, and his apartment was in this building over here. Okay? And what's probably more important for everybody here is that if you follow the street up and look up here, you can actually see this building. You may recognize it as One World Trade Center. He actually told me about going to work in New York City, and each day he would peer down into this ginormous construction site that went down up to 14 stories, right? Because this eventually would be the two towers that would be the two tallest buildings in the world, the World Trade Center. Now, I mentioned my dad had found work. He had a couple of major disadvantages, right? He didn't speak English, and he didn't even have a high school degree. So what do? Again, coincidence plays a role. He meets somebody from his hometown in Algarve, in New York City. His name was Benjamin. And now Benjamin, he knows New York City like the back of his hand, and he had made a bit of a business for himself, bringing donuts and selling them to Portuguese stores, okay, because he knew Portuguese and a little bit of German, strangely enough.